Hey everybody, today we're talking about the CAGED system. Now I know there are already a ton of videos out there about the CAGED system, but in my experience, most of them are overly complicated and overly confusing. So my goal in this video is to give you a very simple explanation of what the CAGED system is and how it can help you in your playing. So the CAGED system is named after the 5 basic open major chords that you can play on guitar. And if you've played guitar for a while, you've probably learned at least some of these chords. There's C major, A major, G major, E major, and D major. What does that spell when we put them all together? CAGED. So that's what the CAGED system is named after. And the idea is that you can take any one of those chord shapes and move them to a different part of the neck to get a different chord. And that's it. That's the main basic insight of the CAGED system. You may have seen other videos or read articles or whatever about other uses for the CAGED system, like soloing and stuff. And yeah, you can use it for that too, but that's all extra stuff. The main insight is you can take one of these chord shapes and slide it up the fretboard to a specific fret to get a specific chord. So let's look at an example using the E major shape. So, according to what I just described to you, I should be able to slide these fingers up and get a different chord, right? So let's try that. I slide these fingers up 1 fret, and what do I get? It's something, but it's not a major chord. It should be an F major chord, right? Because F is just a half step up from E. That's not an F major chord. And the reason is because I moved these 3 notes that I'm fretting up a half step, but I left the open strings behind, right? The open strings, they're the same 3 open strings as they were when I was down here on these frets. So if I want to move one of these chord shapes up, I have to account also for the open strings. And that's going to require me to rearrange some of my fingers. Because in order to move the open strings up, we need to free our first finger so that our first finger can be in charge of kind of acting as a surrogate open string almost as we slide the chord shape up. So this isn't going to work because our first finger is being used here on the G string. So we're going to rearrange our fingers. We're going to replace our second finger with our third finger. Then we're going to move our fourth finger to where our third finger just came from. And then we're going to replace our first finger with our second finger, which, there we go, we got a free first finger now. And now, if we slide these 3 notes up and slide our open strings up 1 fret by doing a bar means you're pressing down more than 1 string with 1 finger. We are, in this shape, we're barring the low E string, the B string, and the high E string. This gives us a proper F major chord. And now that we can do this, now that we've discovered this new rearranged fingering version of the E major shape, we can put this anywhere we want. We can play 12 different chords using this shape just based on where we line up our fingers. And the same goes for all 4 of the other CAGED shapes as well. If we're gonna move any of those shapes up the fretboard, we're gonna have to free up our index finger, our first finger, so that our first finger can act as a surrogate open string and fret whatever strings need to be fretted. So let's look at the D shape, for example. Here's our normal D shape, right? Just playing a D major chord. First finger, third finger, and second finger. We need to free this guy up if we want to move this chord up. So what we're going to do is we're going to replace our first finger with our second finger, not our third finger, our second finger. Then we're going to move our fourth finger to the B string, where our third finger was, and we're going to move our third finger to the high E string, where our second finger was. And that, there you go, frees up our first finger so that when we move up these guys, we can move up the open string to the first fret and now we get a nice major chord. This actually, by the way, is the only one of the caged shapes that isn't a bar chord, because you're not pressing down more than one string with any of your fingers. Usually on all the other ones, you're barring at least 2 strings with your index finger, but this one, no barring necessary. It's a bit of a stretch. You can see you gotta reach quite a bit between these 2 fingers, especially on these low frets, but at least you don't have to bar. So let's talk about now why this whole caged idea is actually useful. You can use different caged shapes to play the same chord and get slightly different sounds out of that same chord. So let's say I want to play an F chord. We played an F chord in our using our E shape already, right? When we moved up a fret. So that's what my F chord sounds like when I use the E shape. I can also play an F chord using the D shape. All I have to do is think about what string the root note for my D shape is on, which is the D string. And then I have to find my target note on that string, in this case F. So if I'm looking for an F on my D string, here's a D, D sharp, E, F, right here. So this would be the location that I would plug in my D shape to in order to get an F chord, because I know my root note is on the correct fret. So here's an F chord using the D shape. Let me get a pick so you can hear what that sounds like, strummed with a pick. So we got an F using the D shape versus an F using the E shape. So you can kind of tell that they're both F chords, right? But they sound different. They sound obviously different. This one, especially that guy, right? You have that high octave on the high E string that you don't get with your E shape. And each one of these caged shapes is going to give you a slightly different sound. So that's where the real usefulness of the caged system comes in, is tailoring the sound that you're going for by choosing the caged shape that gives you that sound. So let's go over the other 3 shapes that we haven't talked about yet, which are actually the first 3 shapes in caged, C, A, and G. So we got our C major shape here, and just like with the other 2, if we want to turn this into a movable shape, we need to free up our first finger. So what we're going to do is we're going to replace our 3rd finger with our 4th finger, replace our 2nd finger with our 3rd finger, and replace our 1st finger with our 2nd finger, which frees us up to slide all these guys up and then bar the, actually we only need to bar the highest 3 strings here, because we're really just barring the G string and the high E string, which gives us this chord, which is a D flat, D, E flat, E, etc. So that's the C major shape. Then we have our A major shape. There's lots of ways to play this. I tend to play it like this, but for the purposes of turning this into a movable shape, the easiest way to do it is this. This is a pretty common way to play this chord anyway. I'm doing my 2nd finger on the D string, 3rd finger on the G string, and 4th finger on the B string. That frees up my index finger to, boom, lay down the bar, 2 frets below these guys, and I'm just barring the A string and the high E string with this one. And then finally the G shape is a particularly tricky one, because you'll see, it's just a bit of a monster. So we have this version of G, which uses all 4 fingers. We can't use this as a movable chord shape because we're already using all 4 fingers, so we can't afford to replace, we don't have any extra fingers to replace our index finger with. So we're going to use this shape. Some people play it like this with the pinky, but where the B string is open. So we're going to take this shape and we're going to replace our 2nd finger with our 3rd finger. We're going to replace our 1st finger with our 2nd finger, and then our fourth finger goes up here on the high E string. And again, there we go. That frees up our index finger to do the barring. And if I slide up a fret, almost guaranteed, I'm not going to be able to play this chord very cleanly. Yeah, there's some buzz or some dull notes there. And that's because this chord just sucks to play. That's just the unvarnished truth. If you slide it up a bit higher, it gets a little bit easier. Like, you can pull it off up here where the strings are a little bit easier to press down and you don't have to stretch as much, but still, it's not a particularly practical shape to use in the context of a song or anything. I've never seen anybody use this full shape in a song, but that doesn't mean the G shape is not useful for us, because what we can do is we can use the bottom part or the top part, and that actually, both of those give us some cool options. So if we just use the bottom part of the chord shape, we can do that. That makes it easier because we don't have to worry about our pinky, but we can make it even easier by using our pinky, our fourth finger on the low E string, and our third finger on the A string. And that gives us a really nice voicing that's pretty easy to play. It's still a bit of a stretch down here, but very practical. Or we can forget about these bottom two strings and just use the from the D string to the high E string, and that way we get this high note. This technically is an inversion because our lowest note is not a root note, but it still works. Still sounds like a full triad. And this one is especially cool because you can do lots of nice little melodic stuff. You get a full major scale that you can play while holding this this chord shape, plus an extra couple notes. So those are your options for the G chord. Not super practical to play the whole thing, but very practical if you break it in half. So we have all 5 of our shapes now. Let's look at an example of how this might be useful in an actual playing scenario. So let's say you're playing a G, C, D chord progression. You got your basic way that you would play this with just the basic open shapes, right? That's most people's default way to play that chord progression. But let's say you want to explore different voicings. You want to see if there's something that sounds better or just fits the vibe that you're going for a little bit better. So we're going to use the CAGED system to see if we can play those 3 chords using some of the different shapes. Well, if we look at our G, one option is to use our friend, the E major shape on the 3rd fret. So that shares the root note location with our open G, right? We know this is G, so we just plug in the right shape. That means we know that if we use our E shape right here on the 3rd fret, that's also going to be a G major chord. So here's our alternate option for G. And then we have C. Well, we know this note is the root note of our C chord, right? So this note can also be the root note of our A major shape. They're both on the A string, both of those root notes for both of those shapes. So we can use the A major shape for our C. So we got G, C, and then D is just a whole step higher than C, so we can actually just slide this A major shape up 2 frets, and that gives us a D. So now we have G, C, D, instead of G, C, D. A little bit of a different vibe. But let's say we want to get even more extreme with it. Let's say we want to move it higher up the fretboard. We want some higher pitched chords. If we take the G chord up an octave, the root note for our G chord up an octave, we move it to the A string and we jump up to the 10th fret, that's a G. So if we think about the 2 caged shapes that have their root note on the A string, what is that? That's C, root note on the A string, or A, obviously root note on the A string. So we can plug in that C major shape here on our 10th fret, and that gives us a G chord. Three slightly different sounds. This one is a little bit more different from the other 2. So here's our higher octave of the G chord. And now we want to look for a C somewhere around here, the note C, on one of the lowest 3 strings, because those are our 3 strings where we have the root notes for our 5 caged shapes. And I see a C right here on the 8th fret of the low E string. So which of the caged shapes have their root notes on the low E string? Well, obviously the E major does, and G major also does. For my money, I'd much rather do the E major shape. Also, my hand is a little bit more closely aligned to that shape anyway. If my C is here, all I have to do is from here, I just, boom, go there, lay down my bar. There's my C chord using the E major shape. So I got G, C, and now, similarly to what we did last time, I could just slide this shape up 2 frets if I want to go for the D major using the same shape as I used for the C major. That works for me on this fretboard. My hand's getting kind of crowded. It's hard for me to get a confident bar here all the way down to the high E string. So I might actually use this G major shape. I could try doing the whole thing. Yeah, okay. But probably I would just use the lowest string. So that gives me G, C, D. Very different vibe from G, C, D. So that's pretty much the entire explanation of the CAGED system. But let me show you one more thing. This is going to blow your mind unless you already know about it, in which case it's just going to be information that you already have. But assuming you don't already know about this and you can't already see it from what we've done, this is going to blow your mind. So you can use the CAGED system to come up with smaller chords using fewer strings, so fragments of those full caged shapes, to do a lot of cool stuff. So let me demonstrate what I mean. Let's use that same chord progression, the G, C, D that we're using, and this time we're going to use our last version that we're up here with, but we're only going to play the highest 3 strings of those 3 shapes. And that's going to give us this cool kind of like mini triad way of playing that chord progression that can be used in very different ways from the full 5 or 6 string versions that we were looking at before. So we take our C major shape that we're using for the G chord, right? And we take these 2 lower strings away, so we're just playing the highest 3 strings. There we go. That still counts. That still counts as a G chord. And then we look at our C chord that we're using the E major shape for. Take these lowest 3 strings away, so we're just playing the highest 3 strings. There we go. That still counts as a C chord. So we got G, C, and then the D, again, we can slide up, or we can use that top half of the G shape, which would give us, we could also do, since we're only playing 3 strings, we could do that different version of the G shape where we have the B string fretted on the same fret as the high E string, but I kind of prefer the sound of that one anyway. So we got ourselves a series of 3-note chords now. We have G, C, D. And this is really cool for all sorts of uses. This is great especially though for if you're playing like second guitar in a band, and or like you're a lead player, you're just writing a part for a chord progression that's already being played by another guitar, and you don't want to just play the same exact chords because what's the point? You can do stuff like this to add just a little bit of sparkle, and it puts you in a different register from the other guitarist and gives you all this room to do stuff without stepping on their feet. So with this, you can do, you could just strum it if you wanted. But you can also do kind of like a picking thing. whatever you're doing. I threw an extra chord in there. I was getting carried away, but you get the idea. That opens up a lot of possibilities of doing chord stuff that can also kind of almost double as lead stuff. Another cool thing about the CAGED system is that the chord shapes kind of overlap as you move up the fretboard. That probably doesn't make sense when I say it like that. Let me show you what I mean. So let's use our C major chord as an example. So if we start with the C shape for the C major chord, it's just regular C shape, right? Open C shape. The next letter in CAGED is A. The A shape shares a root note location, which I think I already mentioned, with the C shape. So if you're practicing this, you can practice C connects to A. I almost played it like this. This is kind of how I tend to play the A shape. I leave out the high E string because it's just easier, especially when you get up into these high frets. This is really awkward, but however you're playing that A shape, your root note is going to be the same location as the root note for the C shape. So we got C shape, then A shape. The next letter is G in CAGED, right? So the G chord shares these three notes on the D, G, and B strings with the A shape. So we keep these guys, but we're now going to bar them and plug in the lower notes for our G shape, or if we want, plug in the higher note. Then, after G comes E, right? So the E shape shares a root note location with the G shape, so we just pivot on that note. There's our E shape for C. And then finally, the D shape shares this middle root note location. So in the E shape, we have three root notes actually in this chord shape. We have low E, or in this case, low C, middle root note on the D string, and then a high root note on the high E string. So this D string note is a root note that is shared by the D shape, the CAGED shape. So they all connect with each other, which is really handy for practicing and to just kind of get an idea of how all these chords are laid out on the fretboard and to find them easily, right? If you're playing a C chord and you want to go through all your options for your different voicings using the CAGED system, C connects to A connects to G, G connects to E, and E connects to D. Okay, so the last thing I want to show you guys is the minor version of CAGED. It doesn't quite work out as neatly as the major version because we're missing the C shape and the G shape. Like you can play a C minor, open C minor, if you really try, but that's an awkward shape, right? And same with G. You can play a G minor if you really try, or if you want that high E string in there, it's even harder. You can do that, but I don't really know anybody. I've never seen those shapes in songs. I don't know anybody who uses them. So when I teach this, I leave those out, and so that just leaves us with an E string version, which is the E minor shape. Good old E minor, the easiest open chord to play. A minor shape, root note on the A string, and then the D minor shape, root note on the D string. So these work exactly the same way as the major ones do. They're just the minor version. So if you want to play in G minor, let's say, and you don't want to deal with this monstrosity, you can use any one of those three shapes. Let's say you're going to use your E minor shape, you just need to find a G on the E string because the E minor shape has its root note on the low E string. So E, F, F sharp, G. There's our G. Plug in that E minor shape. And again, we have to rearrange our fingers. So now we're using third finger, fourth finger for these strings, and we're barring. There's our E minor shape version of a G minor chord. This one is particularly difficult to bar because you also have to get that G string in there with your barring finger, which you don't in the E major version. Or let's say we want to play a G with our A minor shape. If we can find a G on the A string, because our A minor chord shape has its root note on the A string, we can plug in that A minor shape and that'll give us a G minor. G is all the way up, as previously mentioned in our GCD segment that we were talking about, all the way up on the 10th fret of the A string. So it's kind of awkward for me with this guitar, but we can get it. There's our G minor using the A minor shape. And if we want to use our D minor shape, same thing, we got to find a G on our D string because our D minor chord uses the D string for its root note. So D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G. We could also use that shortcut that the 5th fret is going to be the same note as the next higher open string, which we know is G, right? So however you get there, you find your root note that you're looking for, and then you plug in the shape with your rearranged fingers, and you get yourself a G minor chord. All right, guys, that's it for the CAGED system. Hopefully you found this video helpful. If you did, I would very much appreciate it if you like the video and subscribe to the channel. If I left anything out, if you have any questions about anything, feel free to leave a comment. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hey bud, you're on camera. Smile.